Welcome everyone to the July 18th City Council work session. Welcome to everyone here and at home. I want to let you know that Councilor Evans is on the line, and one of our guests, Sabrina Parsons, is also on the line. Okay. So first up, we're going to deal with, you have a motion in front of you that Councilor Taylor is going to make.
Thank you. I move to authorize the city manager to use up to $10,000 from council contingency for city costs for police and street closures for the Eugene Celebration Parade.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion? I see none. Yes.
I guess I'll just ask, what is the balance of council contingency at this point?
47,000.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Councilor
Yeah, I would just say that there are other parades, or in times past there have been other parades that other members of the community enjoy participating in, and I hope that when and if those opportunities arise, we'll give them the same consideration as we would this one that takes place in the South.
Councilor Polling.
Well, I can't support the motion. First of all, when we're looking in every nook and cranny for every penny for our budget, I think spending up to $10,000 for a parade to help a private enterprise put the parade on is wrong. Plus, I agree with what Mike said. You know, there have been other organizations that have wanted to put on parades. And in fact, we lost the one parade to Springfield because the city didn't want to help fund with police escorts and road, blocking the roads. So I just can't support this at this time. The way our budget is, our financing is, it just doesn't make sense at all to me.
Councilor Brown.
Well, I will support it because we've been getting floods of emails, and I'm accosted on the street or at my business almost every day by people who are really upset that the celebration has been canceled and want to at least have the parade. And so I think there's wide public support for this. It will not affect the city's budget at all, the general fund. We have the money has already been allocated to our contingency fund, and it's to be used for contingencies, and this is a contingency. It can't be used for any other purpose. So I will definitely support it. Thank you.
Councilor Taylor.
It's a celebration for all of Eugene. It isn't for a particular group. It is not a certain organization. It's the city celebration, and people really do care about it, and many people were upset at the idea that there wouldn't be anything this year. Thank you.
I consider the Eugene Celebration Parade as an iconic event that happens to celebrate our community every year and very important to the community. And I was contacted by, I contacted them along Representative Hoyle and I both contacted Kesey Enterprises and said, is there any way that we can keep this parade going? And met with them, and they are not charging anything for their cost. They're doing it as to work with the city to make this happen too. So this is a little bit that we can do for the part that we require to have a parade. I think we're ready to vote on this. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Greg?
Aye.
6 in opposition. 2. It passes. Thank you all very much. Next up is our major item of the day. And that is sick leave.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm just going to pass this on to Jason Dedrick from the City Manager's Office.
Hi. Good afternoon, Mayor and Councilors. My name is Jason Dedrick in the City Manager's Office. I'm here today to give you an update on the sick leave ordinance process, primarily to give you an update on the work of the task force. Thank you. And then I'll turn it over to our task force co-chairs for give them an opportunity to share some thoughts on the process as well. So I have a brief presentation here just to give you an overview on that. So I'll talk a bit about your process to date, again, talk about the task force, go over the structure of the final report, and briefly on some of the conversations that happened there. We'll not be speaking a lot to the process going forward, but if we have questions after your discussion, we certainly can go there. And then, as I mentioned, I'll dig in a little bit on the final report, and then We do have our co-chairs here. One is George Rohde here next to me, and then Sabrina Parsons on the phone, and so they will be available for questions that you may have about the task force process once we're concluded. So your process to date, work sessions in February and April to initiate this look at a sick leave ordinance and scoping the project. Task force was appointed by the mayor. There were 4 meetings of the task force in May and early June. Their task was to produce a final report, and so we're here today with that, and you have that in your packet. And then just kind of a quick review of the public input and the process for that thus far. There have been, as you know, many emails that have come to you, as well as emails that have come to staff on this issue. There has been public testimony at your council meetings during your public forum. And then we also have received public comment at the task force meetings themselves. Several of those meetings we had time allocated at the end of the meeting for the public that was in attendance to share their comments with us. And so we also received a fair bit of input there as well. So certainly hasn't been a shortage of input from the public thus far. So just a quick walkthrough on this final report as to the major components that are there. And again, you have this in front of you. In terms of what's in here, on page 2, there's a summary of the document itself, and you'll also find a listing of all the attachments that are here. As I mentioned in the email when we sent this out, the bulk of this packet are the attachments. The report itself is relatively brief. So if you want to look to any of the attachments, that's where you can find them. Then on page 3 is a summary of the task force scope, excuse me, and also what they reviewed at their meetings. This is a great time for me to point out that the task force was not charged with coming forward with any kind of recommendation of any kind. Their work was really to investigate the issues around this, to vet various things, to analyze some of the information that was brought to them, to listen and to hear from each other, and to produce the final report. So again, it was not to produce any kind of recommendation. Page 3 there also lays out what was talked about at each of those meetings. Pages 4 through 7 address 6 key components of a potential ordinance, or at least of the Portland ordinance, which, again, your direction to the task force was to start with the Portland ordinance as a base. So that is what the task force did. At their first meeting, the task force surfaced all of the issues that they wanted to talk about during their process. Some of those issues were within their scope, some were more in the scope of your work, and I'll mention those in a few minutes. It really ended up boiling down to 6 key things that folks really wanted to make sure they got time to talk about at the meetings. And so these are those 6 key components, and I'll talk more about those in a few minutes. Page 8 mentions other items that the task force had raised as wanting to address. Some of those there was time to talk about, and some there were not. And then on page 9, what you'll find are the various issues that were raised by the group that were not within their scope to really address, but perhaps more within your scope. And so I'll review those in detail also in a few minutes. And then pages 10 through 15, I will not be talking about that section of the report. However, this represents a time at our last meeting where each member had time to share final thoughts on their process. And the full transcript of their remarks are there in the report, pages 10 through 15. So it's a great read in terms of getting a good sense of the different perspectives that are out there. So I encourage you to take a look at all of those comments that were submitted. And again, the attachments include the Portland ordinance as well as their administrative rules, the presentations that occurred at those meetings, and also the minutes from their meetings. So again, if you have any questions, that's a good place to go. So at this point, I'm going to take just a few minutes to really just kind of dip our toe in on these 6 issues that they spent the bulk of their time discussing. It's important to note that this is not the time in your process where you're going to learn everything you need to know about the Portland ordinance. This is really just going to be a quick look at highlighting some of the items that they talked about during their discussion. So the first of these 6 was paid time off, or PTO. These 6 will include a statement that it was kind of the issue statement, and then some of the highlights of their discussion. So the issue in Portland, an employer with a PTO or paid time off policy that equals or exceeds the ordinance is compliant. It includes traditional as well as vacation pay accounts, and vacation pay accounts are a very specific term for something that the building trades have. So some of the discussion around this issue, one comment or a series of comments around a discussion was that if you have a plan that is compliant currently, and that you would be front-loading in terms of awarding your employees all of that sick time at the beginning of the year, it would decrease the amount of tracking and paperwork that employer would have throughout the year. However, task force members did point out that there would still be administrative requirements involved. So if you're an employer with a paid time off policy that would be consistent or beyond an ordinance that Eugene may have, you may still have some administrative tracking requirements. There was some concern raised during the meetings about employees and how they use sick time versus vacation time. So again, if they have a PTO, paid time off policy, where their paid and their sick time are together, concern that employees might be choosing to come to work sick and preserving what they would otherwise use as vacation time. So that was some of the conversation that happened there. And then also a fair bit of conversation around the building trades and the very specific situation that they have with hiring halls, and that the folks who work in the building trades actually work for multiple employers, and that they've established a system that addresses their sick time and vacation time. So some discussion around that issue as well. The next core component was the idea of paid leave versus unpaid protected leave, and also how you establish the size of businesses. And so in Portland, businesses with 5 or fewer employees are required to provide unpaid leave. Businesses with 6 or more employees provide paid leave. And that includes, in terms of how you count those employees, it includes your temporary and your part-time employees, not just full-time employees. So some of the commentary around this issue, some felt that all employees should receive paid leave regardless of business size. There was some discussion as to why 6 would be the cutoff for unpaid versus paid leave, why not higher numbers. And then also some discussion on around the fact that this would have a large impact on businesses that rely on temporary or part-time employees. And one of those that came up in particular were home health care businesses that structure their business around a lot of temporary employees. So those were some of the items of discussion there. Another core component of a potential ordinance would be maximum hours and how those hours are carried over. Portland's ordinance, employees accrue a maximum of 40 hours annually. That amount can be used in following years. However, the employer is not required to allow for employees to use this topic, this core component, actually received probably the least discussion of the 6. So there was little discussion about different accrual rates or different carryover provisions. There was some commentary around the fact that it's easier if Eugene had an ordinance that was as consistent as possible with Portland, the concern there being employers who have employees who would work in both cities. And then similar to the last issue, concern about this maximum hours and the carryover for building trade industries that have established something different. The next core component was the effective date of a potential ordinance. Portland's ordinance was effective on January 1st, 2014, which was the first of the year following the year that they adopted their ordinance. So there was some commentary around wanting to have a grace period for enforcement. And then, as you can imagine, 2 different lines of conversation around more time being needed or the time being now to go forward with this. So on the front of more time being needed, concern about the fact that Portland's ordinance is relatively new and wanting to wait and see what issues may come up there. And also some note that the task force did not spend time looking at a lot of other ordinances, mostly just Portland, so the desire to look at other ordinances. And then the commentary around moving forward sooner rather than later, the idea that a lot of work went into the Portland ordinance and that we don't necessarily need to redo that work or rethink it, and then just the concept that workers have been waiting for a benefit like this. Another issue that was core component here was collective bargaining agreements. Portland's ordinance does not exempt employers that have employees subject to a collective bargaining agreement or CBA, nor does it require them to renegotiate. There was some commentary around the fact that most other cities did not exempt collective bargaining agreements, and some question as to why peace was not something that was discussed. There was discussion of the fact that Seattle does exempt collective bargaining agreements if both the union and the workers agree on that front. So something that was noted there. Some employers may feel that they need to amend their collective bargaining agreements. Again, in Portland, there's not a requirement to do that, but there was the note that some employers may feel compelled to do that simply because of all the things that go into collective bargaining agreements. And then more research on how many collective bargaining agreements would be impacted in Eugene and what an exemption might look like. And then finally, the last component dealt with two city commuters or employees that may work in multiple cities. Portland's ordinance requires that employees who travel to Portland and make a stop to conduct work will accrue leave for the hours that they work in the city. However, that leave can only be used if they are scheduled to work in the city at the time that they take that leave. So some of the commentary here could be burdensome for employers in our region who have employees in multiple cities, and the desire to have us engage with our regional partners because it could impact them. Some discussion around the 240-hour minimum. So the threshold to establish as an employee subject to this provision would be that they work 240 hours in a year. Commentary that helps define what an employee is and clears that up, but also some thoughts around the fact that that could be difficult for employees who are close to that threshold but never reach it. So as I mentioned, there were several things that the task force raised that they wanted to discuss during their meetings. However, the decision was made, at least at the staff level, that these were things that were more in the purview of council to address. So there was some question about the connection between an ordinance such as this and council goals. Question as to what the cost would be to the city entity itself for this effort, as well as what the impacts would be in terms of covering our employees. What is the relationship between potential ordinance and the triple bottom line? What is the timeline for this project as compared to the timeline on other city projects recently? What time will there be, and what will public input look like? The opportunity for public input look like around a draft ordinance? Questions about getting some additional Eugene-specific data about our employees, who's covered here, who isn't. And then lastly, more information on public health or statistics related to stable families. So those were items that the task force did not discuss, but were items that they were interested in having you potentially discuss as part of your process. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our task force co-chairs. After we give them an opportunity to reflect on the experience, we also want to have the three counselors that were part of the task force have an opportunity as well, and then there'll be time for questions, particularly of our task force members. So we have two individuals here today. They were the co-chairs for this effort, which primarily meant that they assisted staff and council with designing meetings, in between meetings, what the structure of those meetings would look like, and then of course being here to help present this. So we have George Rohde and Sabrina Parsons, again serving as co-chairs. Sabrina is on the phone with us today, and she does need to depart early, so I'm going to have her speak first. Sabrina is the CEO of Palo Alto Software here in Eugene, a position she's been in since 2007. She's also on the board of directors for the Chamber of Commerce, and she's also on the Eugene 4J School District Budget Committee. So Sabrina, who is on the phone with us, if you'd like to share a few thoughts on this experience, now would be the time.
Yeah, thank you, Jason, and I apologize for not being able to be there in person. I was planning to, but then as a small business owner, had to unfortunately change plans because I got to keep running my business. So I appreciate all your time. I really thank the mayor and her staff for involving me in the process. In terms of my thoughts, overall, I think it was really useful and important to get people to the table, both small business owners as well as members of organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, Family Forward, Main Street America, to all be at the same table and all be able to talk to each other about the concerns and the issues relating to the ordinance. So I thought that the purpose of the task force to make sure that we brought issues and concerns to you, the City Council, was accomplished. I felt it was really important to be able to have very varied opinions and discussions and understand different points of views. And I felt it was also really a very useful way to get a lot of information about what's happened in other cities who've implemented an ordinance like this, and not just Portland, because we had a lot of discussion about Seattle and San Francisco, and how we may or may not want to look at the data that's available from those cities. So overall, from my perspective, I felt like the task force accomplished the goals set out by City Council. And, from my perspective, as someone who is very much in support of the ordinance, I felt it was very useful to understand the other side and the concerns and the opinions. And going through the process, I think you as a city council will be able to address many of those concerns and will be able to really intelligently discuss and potentially, hopefully, make more people who are in opposition happy about an ordinance because you know the concerns that have been brought forth by the task force.
Thank you.
Yep, so thank you very much. And I also thank George because it's been great to be able to work with him and understand his point of view as a fellow small business owner.
Great. And now I'm going to introduce George Rohde. He is the owner of Euro-Asian Automotive, which he has been the owner of for almost 40 years now, as well as Auto House and Stadium Automotive. He's also a member of the Citizen Review Board and the Police Commission.
Also on board president of two nonprofits, Eugene Springfield Youth Orchestra and Mackenzie Personnel, and do a whole bunch of other stuff. Obviously, and also a volunteer over at SCORE, helping small businesses succeed. And in the corner of businesses, one of the things that concerns me is the high failure rate of business. It's something like 50% in the first year, 80% in the first 5 years. So to add additional burden in talking and listening to the people of the costs of it, one of the things that was pointed out to me is they say it will be a 1 to 2% cost to the or 1 to 2.5% cost to the business, depending on how labor intensive you are. But picking a 2% cost, most businesses work on a profit level of 2 to 4% or 2% up to about 15%. Most averaging somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10%. And you take 2% of that, and what that means is profitability of businesses would take 10 to 20% of their profitability. Keeping in mind 1 to 2% sounds like a real small number, but when you crunch the numbers, as I said, most businesses average about 10% profit. So it would be a huge burden on businesses. There was also a concern for a viable Eugene, Oregon employment picture. We did note that the employment rate went up 0.1%, that it would create a situation where there would be less, you would start going down to the bare minimum of employees.
Rich, how did you feel about the fairness of the process?
Well, that's a great question. One of the things that, and by the way, on the police commission, we're talking about a lot of biases. So I look at things so much more through biases and my biases and everybody. I think there was an imbalance in the task force, tremendous, and I'm going to say approximately 80% were pro and about, and including the two city councilors and the mayor. It was very obvious. So it seemed like it was, and I'm going to use the word, a little bit biased. So I was a little upset with that. The process when we had an employment attorney came in and talked, it was upsetting to some pro people, and yet when we had the commissioner from Portland who, and by the way, biases are just part of life. There's nothing wrong with being biased. That's what humans do. But when the bias of the Portland commissioner came in, it was so very apparent how wonderful it was. So as of having, I think if you have a level playing field, you have 50% from one side and 50% come from the other side, and that, in the estimation of small businesses, was not not that way. How well did the committee work together? Kitty, you did a great job leading these meetings, and I thank you very, very kindly. A lot of great information, and both with Alan and Claire, a lot of great information came out. I mean, from that standpoint, I think it was a pretty thorough job, and it has also had me appreciate how thorough the city is looking at this. So there was some really, really good points. Getting back to some of the things one of the business people were concerned about is the urgency of this, and it turns out by some of the people that started this ball rolling, they've been working on it as to their own admission to well over a year, and yet my comment in there felt kind of like a snowball coming down. It was moving really, really fast in Eugene, and a high amount of urgency, which Portland has just started it, and it would be really, I would like to love City of Eugene so much to one-up the Portland ordinance and study from their mistakes. That's where I theorize you learn your most, is from mistakes made by other people. So the urgency factor was consistently through this of why it needs to be so very, very quick, keeping in mind this is the largest by far financial impact to businesses, second followed by a nickel a bag by that, which was a small impact to the businesses, but this is huge, mounting to millions and millions and millions of dollars of burden on small businesses. So that is our concern. One of the people mentioned the bookkeeping end of it is difficult, and they made suggestions of a week is a real good number, 40 hours instead of 30 hours. It is the vagueness of the ordinance of let's say suspected sick time abuse is very, very undefined, and that was a concern of a lot of people. And the reason being is there's something called litigation, and there are attorneys that specialize in litigation. And another concern is the sick time was too vague, as I said, but there is no stipulation that said, let's let BOLI handle the enforcement and keep private, do not allow private rights of action, that is a litigation attorney, into it. So I think there are really some good parts of this, but I caution very much that all the impact to small business, which I consider a very, very vulnerable thing. I'm struggled for years and years. I started my own business on a shoestring, and there were many, many times of I wouldn't buy bananas unless they were on sale. And I think that a lot of small businesses, in coaching over at SCORE, we find a lot of businesses just struggling, coming in to learn more about it. And what really scares me is the majority of small businesses that come in to our organization do not keep books at all, or very limited books, and this would put an incredible extra burden on them doing the bookkeeping, which they're not doing now, and would make people, small businesses, and I want to use the word, outside the scope of being legal. So I caution you, particularly in these tougher times. Thank you. And by the way, it was such an honor to be here, and such an honor to work with Kitty and the task force. I really, really appreciate the opportunity, and the counselors, the opportunity to do this, because I love Eugene very, very much. Thank you.
At this point, in terms from the staff perspective, we're completed with what we have. If you want.
So I'm going to call on the counselors who participated in the task force to see if they have comments. Councilor Surratt?
Sure. I'll just want to thank the members of the task force and George and Sabrina for the extra time that you both put in helping us shape the agenda and shape the final report. I think it was very good work, and from my perspective, really helped illuminate some important issues that I think we can look to make ours version a little bit better and a little easier for folks to work with. I am surprised by George's remarks about feeling that the task force was slanted. We had Dave Hauser, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, there. We had folks who represent labor unions there. And then we had, I thought, a pretty fair spectrum of local business folks who ranged from in complete opposition to this idea to neutral to in full support. And, you know, I felt that folks did a really good job representing their views at the table and sharing their concerns and sharing their ideas, really good ideas for how we could either keep this exactly the same as Portland's, because that will be easiest for those businesses who work in both cities, or make some adjustments. So in any case, I just really appreciate the work that was put into it. I also want to appreciate staff and the mayor for helping us get through the process and create what I think is some useful information for us to look at as we consider what we want to do here in Eugene.
Councilor Pryor?
Thank you. I came kind of late to the process. I only was able to attend the last two meetings, so part of why I was there was to listen as much as I could and kind of get a feel for where the different people were in the room. And I think for me, one of the important elements was, did this group meet sincerely and honestly? Was it trying to do the work in however short a time that it was asked to do? And I think it was, absolutely. And I value and respect every member, whether they were for, against, or neutral. I think everybody was trying to get to a good place. And the challenge was to have such a short amount of time to get there. And it left many people feeling as if they had had the appetizer but didn't get the main course. And whether that's true or not, I think, is not really as significant as how people feel leaving. And so for me, it was important to say, did I walk away with an increased level of clarity or an increased level of certainty? Because that, as we ultimately have to make a decision, we have to, as much as possible, utilize some level of clarity or certainty in order to do it. And I think this group brought me a lot further along than I thought it might in terms of helping me find some clarity and certainty. But in other regards, it actually created more fog, which I'm not saying was a bad thing. In some cases, that fog was actually helpful to identify areas that will still need to be worked on. And I appreciate Claire saying that it was enlightening for her to recognize there are still many issues that need to be worked on, because this is not simple or easy. And I think to craft something that has benefit and a payoff has got to have the time in order to clear away as much of that fog as possible. So I appreciate the fact that the committee raised some very important and very legitimate questions that we will have to work through as we proceed. And for that, I'm thankful. Less about the answers I got than perhaps knowing what the right questions are.
Councilor Zelenka?
Yeah, I too would like to thank the members of the task force, especially spending their evenings with us discussing this important issue, and Sabrina and George, the extra time spent as co-chairs. I notice Dave Hauser and Kevin are both in the audience too, so thank you, as well as to everybody else. The goal of the task force, though, was to bring to light the important issues for the council to consider when in our discussion of earned paid sick time ordinance. And they weren't supposed to make a recommendation, but so the report reflects that, I think, very well. The group had, I think, a really good cross-section of points of view, both opponents and proponents, small and large business perspective, as well as advocates. And maybe the task force comments reflect the fact that the latest poll showed 75% of the people support earned paid sick time. So maybe that was reflected in the way that we had the comments made too. I think it also provided additional comment from public in the public hearing, public comment portion. We had very many opinions aired in this, and I think they're captured pretty well in the document. Good discussion, brought to light the opinions about those big six issues that Jason was talking about. You can see that in the report. And as is Eugene, we could have talked about this for probably years, but we have timeline. I think timelines and deadlines are good, so they make things work a little better. This is one of the many different venues that the council has for getting input. We're going to have as well as the task force public forums that we've had. We've had emails, we've had phone calls, we've had letters. We're going to have a public hearing, so we'll have an enormous amount of public input that we'll go through. One of the things I learned in this process is that the whole thing didn't start with Portland. There are 8 cities and jurisdictions that have already done this. And the first was actually San Francisco 8 years ago, DC 6 years ago, state of Connecticut, and Seattle almost 2 years ago, and Portland about 6 months. So actually, there's a long history behind this policy, and Portland actually used San Francisco and Seattle's model to start off with, and then we're using Portland's derivative of that. So it's going way back in terms of time and expertise and what's happened in other communities. So as to the 1 to 2%, I think that's the theoretical maximum that business could see. That assumes, I think, that if all employees took every single hour that they earned, well, I think studies have shown that maybe half of that is true, that they actually take or is used. And then finally, I think this earned paid sick time policy is really a multidimensional issue. That really came up to the fore. It's not only a public health issue, but it's also an equity issue for workers. It's an issue about impacts to businesses, and there's the administrative parts of putting together and implementing this thing. But all in all, I think the task force accomplished its goal of bringing to light the important issues and the differing opinions about those issues to council for us for our discussion.
Thank you all, and thank you for participating. Jason, do you have the actual language that council gave, the direction they gave the task force? Is that in the...
I do. It is in the packet. It is in their scope, which is the first attachment. Oh, yes, sorry, page 16. Would you like for me to read that? Okay. So, the scope section of that document reads, there are a range of policy decisions that could shape the ordinance. The task force can vet options in order to provide community perspective to council on various possibilities. In order to do that, the task force is asked to investigate issues and understand facts, objectively analyze potential policy options, listen to a broad spectrum of viewpoints, and produce a report of findings addressed to council.
Thank you. And just to be clear, I'm going to name the members of the council of the task force. Patty McConnell's the president of Old Dominion Collision Repair, and she's a strong opponent of the sick leave policy. Bob Burry, CEO of Euphoria Chocolate Company, participated. He does provide sick leave and had some suggestions about how we might go through this process. Stephen Michael is the state director of the Main Street Alliance of Oregon, made up of small businesses, and a proponent. Kevin Billman is the Director of Legislative and Community Affairs for United Food and Commercial Workers. Lily Hoag's the Policy Director of Family Forward. John Molis is the Secretary-Treasurer of Lane, Coos, Curry, Douglas Building Trades. Ed Gertis is the Vice President and General Counsel of Cafe Yum, which has business in both Portland and Eugene, so we get that perspective. You met Sabrina on the phone here. And you met George, and then Dave Hauser, the president of the Eugene Chamber of Commerce, and Karen Stewart, who's the local government affairs director of CenturyLink, which also has businesses both in Eugene and Portland. So that's the people who participated in the committee, and their comments are in the report for everyone to read. So right now I'm going to turn it over to, and we got George and Sabrina here. It's a good time to direct any questions you have to the co-chairs or in general. Mike, you're up first, I think.
Thank you, Mayor. Please put me in each and every round of the discussion today, if you would, please.
I'll just do that when you
Thank you. So I shall tell you each time?
Sure.
Okay. I appreciate the work of the committee. This was a good deal of work. I hope that people will heed what George Rohde said today. By my count of what the mayor just went through there, of the 18 people on the task force, was that the total number, including the councilors and mayor?
I chaired it. I'm not a member.
Of all the people who served there, I think we may have had 2.5 to 3 people opposed. Now, from my perspective, if the job of the of this task force was to bring to light any concerns, issues, and potential problems. It would have been wiser, as George mentioned, for us to have more folks involved that may have had concerns, but be that as it may, I appreciate the work that they did. One of the interesting things for me about this was that when I read the newspaper this morning, I laughed out loud. And I don't often do that, but I did today, because the the story on today's front page talking about this says that the council will begin debate today, and it talks about how we're going to take up the discussion of whether or not we'll approve some manner of sick leave. And the reason I laughed out loud is because the article talks about there'll be a neutral presentation, and then we'll have a discussion back and forth about whether or not to do this. Now, I think everybody at this table knows that, of course, that this is going to pass, that some kind of sick leave ordinance will be the case when we're done here. This isn't a debate about whether or not to do it. And for me, that's the part that's interesting, because with all that participation, it's my opinion that there's no amount of public testimony, there's no amount of emails, there's no amount of concern and warning from our interjurisdictional partners and other municipalities in the county. There's no amount of warning that this can have a bad impact on our local business climate from the chamber. There's no amount of warning that this could cause fights with other municipalities. There's no amount of concern that would result in 5 no votes at this table by the time we're done. None. And I think everybody here knows it. So we're going to go through this process, and this is kind of preordained, and I think it's helpful for us to say that out loud. This is prearranged. You know, the fix is in here. We're going to pass this. It's going to be the case. The only debate we're going to have is how much damage the council majority is willing to inflict on the people of our community by force. And I have to tell you, I was once, well, I'm going to run out of time here, so please put me in the next round, Mayor.
Glad to do that. Anybody else got anything they want to say? Councilor Taylor.
Don't want Mike to have to do it all. First, I think the list of people on the task force is really impressive. I'm amazed you got all of those people to go to 4 meetings. That's impressive too, that they were willing to spend that much time. I don't know what is meant by the fixes in. I don't think anything has been fixed. But and also, I don't know who the half person is that Mike mentioned, 2.5 people. I'd like the half person to stand up. I don't think we're rushing this at all. I think we've been spending quite a lot of time, and the people who have been, the citizens who've been working on this have spent a great deal of time, and councilors have by now spent a good amount of time. I think we've more time than we've spent on some other things, and I think it's that I don't think we're rushing, but I think we should be willing to do it fairly soon. Thanks.
Councilor Polling.
Thank you. You know, I'm not the least bit surprised by Mr. Rohde's comments about the process either. And I kind of feel like the way Mike does, that this was kind of a done deal as soon as the request for the poll went out for the work session, based on the conversations that we had. You know, we received a stack of letters from, I guess it was a week before last in our council packet, from the group that's supporting this, where they went out and they contacted people in the community. And these letters are basically, I support this. Well, I went through and did a random selection and made contact. And basically, there were vague references made to the Portland ordinance, since we don't have an ordinance in place to discuss. It was kind of a situation, some of the comments I heard was, well, yeah, when they said that, are you in favor of a mandatory paid sick leave ordinance? I said yes. But then when they started questioning, well, you know, I mean, there was never any question, rather, about the cost to the businesses or how it's going to impact the other communities. That was never brought up. And it's kind of a deal where, you know, I look at it, the presentation, the impression I got from the presentation to the people was walking up to somebody and said, would you like a new car? And of course you're going to say yes, but would you like to pay for it? Once you get into the details, you have a different opinion. And that's kind of the impression I got from these letters that went out. We're always making reference to the city of Portland in their ordinance, which was, my understanding, wasn't really actually, it was supposed to take effect January 1st of this year, but I'm a little confused on to whether or not it actually took effect or if the starting date was pushed back. And we've heard at this table how, there's been no problems reported in the city of Portland. Well, that's because they haven't had any reporting back to the council on the effects of the ordinance yet. So of course you're not going to have any reported problems. And, again, I'm going to repeat every time this comes up. We are not Seattle. We are not Washington, D.C. We are not San Francisco. We are not Portland. When I have been contacted by elected officials from the other cities, as well as the county, and other business owners from other cities saying this is going to negatively impact us, what the city of Eugene is going to negatively impact us, I think we need to step back and look at what we're doing. I think we're going to have some more problems on our hands that we're not even aware of yet. And to me, we're not listening to the people that are actually in the trenches doing the work. The people that are having already to track time that their employees are spending in Portland, and the cost and the burden that it's causing their HR people. So I'm just a little concerned at the way we're going at this whole process.
Councilor Pryor.
It's interesting. I mentioned earlier about the notion for clarity and certainty, and one of the things that I think is really a challenge here is the lack of certainty that we have, whether we have certainty around the numbers we're dealing with, certainty around the outcome of this debate. I don't know if it's going to be what it is, whether it be 4 or 5 or what it will be. Some of us feel we're certain. I'm not as certain, and I think certainty is the issue that's at question here. We talk about the figures of who it will impact, what it will impact, how much it will impact, and none of that is based on actual data. The city tried to collect data and couldn't do it. Proponents have tried to collect data, and they have what they believe is certain data. Opponents have collected what they thought is data, and they are certain that their data is accurate. None of that data agrees. And we don't have certainty. It would be nice to have certainty, but sometimes we have to approach a decision without a lot of certainty. And in that case, you try to figure out what are the issues that you're really trying to resolve, and can you resolve them in a way that doesn't create other problems. For me, that was the important element here. When we talk about the principle of protecting employees, I've not really run across anybody who insists on having the right to fire employees when they're sick. But on the other hand, I have heard people who express great concern about what would be perhaps unintended consequences of trying to preserve that right. And for me, I was first attracted to this measure by its ability to meet that first principle, to protect employees. And I still, to this day, feel that's a very important principle to abide by. We should guarantee that an employee should not be fired for being sick for one day. But in trying to protect that right or that need, what's the path along which we go? And I know we have ideas that have come from other cities, but yeah, Eugene is not all those other cities, but we can be guided by those other cities, whether they've done it for a few years or whether they've done it for 6 months. There may be some guidance we can have there. I'm looking for a way that we can, as a community, be clear on what principle we want to work towards. Some people have argued that the principle is not invading not government invading business, which is a principle. And so you then have to decide which principle is the one that's the more persuasive for me. The protective principle, the non-interference principle, or any of 4 or 5 other principles that may be engaged here. That's what our job is having to decide between conflicting principles. And some of us feel great clarity because we're very clear on our principles, but none of us have certainty around the facts on this, and that's the most troubling piece for me. We lack certain facts, and we're trying to make decisions on policy that have great implications. Few things rise to the level of passion that this has risen to, and we require some level of certainty in order to navigate that.
Councilor Brown.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, we don't have any facts for Eugene because we haven't done this yet. And so, a lot of these suppositions are just that. They're just suppositions. And we're hearing a lot of the same things that I'm quite sure that people heard in San Francisco 7.5 years ago when they enacted theirs. And I'm sure they heard it for the 2 years before they enacted it when they were working on it. We heard all that. Heard the same things. It's going to kill businesses. People will leave town. We're going to have to lay people off. It'll be too burdensome. The people in Washington D.C. 5.5 years ago, when they enacted theirs, no doubt heard similar concerns that the businesses would flee the District of Columbia to Maryland and Virginia because it would be too onerous and they just simply couldn't possibly do it. And I'm sure they heard the same thing in Connecticut when the whole state did it. And it's true, there's not a heck of a lot of data, but there is some data from San Francisco and Washington, D.C. The auditor of the District of Columbia did a study, and we can get copies of that. Studies were done in San Francisco. The fears did not come true. It did not hurt businesses in any of those locations. And I've done some internet searches for data-based, fact-based analyses of any problems that may have been caused by those ordinances, 6-pay ordinances in San Francisco and in D.C. and in Connecticut, and I can't find any. And if anyone has seen some or has some research data showing negative impacts in any of those 3 locations, will you please share them with the council? But, I'd like them to be actual economic analyses. I can't find any negative reports other than basically kind of propaganda stuff, but nothing from a reputable research company. Hopefully neutral, political viewed research company. They do exist. So the data that I've seen so far has been positive, and I guess that's all. Thanks.
Sabrina, I know you're going to have to leave because you have to go give a speech pretty quick here. Do you have any final comments before you sign off here?
Yeah, I would just definitely like to make sure you guys look at all the data and really look at data in the right way, because data can say so many different things. And I believe that the cost that's been reported in other cities is 2% of payroll, not 2% of all revenue. So, again, and I could be mistaken, but I just want to make sure that you guys are looking at data and data that isn't through the viewpoint of pro or against, but from an economic point of view. The other part is that while there may be 12,500 businesses in Eugene, to also look at actual businesses with employees, because nationally 78% of businesses don't have employees. And so if you apply that to Eugene, and then you go one step further and you say, of those that are left over that actually have employees, less than 20% of them actually have more than 4 employees. So the impact on Eugene is there, but it is there for people who actually employ firms. So when I penciled it out, it was under 2,000 firms that were impacted, and of those, we don't know how many of those already comply. So I think that data is very important, but data can say lots of different things. So if there's a way to get data directly from economic statisticians and not from or against opponents, I think you're going to have data that tells you better information.
Thank you so much for your time today, Sabrina. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm reachable, Sabrina@paloalto.com, if any city councilor has any other questions or concerns or anything. I'm very glad to be involved, and I'm very glad to make myself more available.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Round 2.
Thank you, Mayor. I thought it was interesting. I understand and appreciate what Councilor Brown mentioned about this not hurting businesses and having data around that. And I have to say, certainly we're all concerned with how well business does in the aggregate in our community. I'm nowhere near as concerned about how this hurts business, because I don't think it will, as much as I'm concerned how it'll hurt people and hurt our city. A business, by definition, is going to adapt or perish. They'll either figure out a way to pay for it or they won't, and they'll either get on with it or they'll go out of business. If they go out of business, that has some obvious bad effects for our community and our tax base. If they decide to adapt to it, they're going to have to pay for that with somewhere. A 2% increase in wages, as Ms. Parsons just mentioned, gets paid for somehow. It's not going to come out of profitability. It's going to come out of other benefits to employees. It's going to come out of employees' pay. And that's going to be borne by everybody. It's not going to be borne by the company per se and its health. So my concern is with the impact on people. My concern is with the impact to our tax base as a community, because we already have trouble keeping the Sheldon branch of the library open and keeping the Sheldon pool open and keeping all the other things and the human service impacts that we talk about in budgeting time. To the degree that this has a detrimental effect on our tax base, it's going to make affording those things harder. One of the things that I mention all the time is how I wish we would do more to talk about expanding our tax base. And my colleague is right, we don't have magic pixie dust that we can sprinkle on the economy to make it better, but we can sure as heck avoid hurting it, and that's what this does. This is one of those things where I understand the nature of the desire to do good with this, but I think the ultimate end is that it hurts more people than it helps. For me, I was once chided for bringing up the idea in a process session that I thought we should say the Pledge of Allegiance in front of formal council meetings, and I was chided that that was a divisive issue. Well, I contend that this is the most divisive issue in our community that's been raised in my entire 8 years of service. It will divide us from our neighbors. It will divide us from our business community. It will create backlash that we will see at the ballot box with charter amendments to limit us from doing similar things in the future. It will cause much more harm than it will do good, but my fear is we have no choice. It's going to pass. Please put me in the next round, Mayor.
We'll do that. Claire?
Thank you. So, not surprisingly, I completely disagree with my colleague, Councilor Clark. One of the things that we learned at the task force was that we actually have many employers in this community who are offering a variety of great benefits of various kinds, which was wonderful to hear. But there was still kind of this theme of a gap with providing earned paid sick time. And because of the public health imperative, in my view, it is appropriate for the government to step in and bridge that gap. Businesses that want to provide sick time right now would be doing it without a level playing field. They'd be at a competitive disadvantage to a similar employer next door. And so an ordinance of this kind would provide a level playing field, a basic set of standards by which all businesses would be, employers would be expected to operate. We currently know that there are 25,000 workers in the city of Eugene who lack access to earned paid sick time and who face the risk of being fired if they need to stay home to take care of themselves or a sick child or family member. So right now, the burden that we're talking about, that there's this concern that business is going to be unduly burdened, is actually falling on individuals and their families, and amongst them the folks in our community who are the least able to bear this burden, and that leads to financial and emotional stress and an inability to improve their financial situation and a burdening of our social services that working families turn to when their employment doesn't provide sufficient leave for their needs. So and then there's the public health piece, which is reducing the spread of illness in the workplace and at daycare centers and at schools, which affects all of us, coworkers, customers, and parents. I actually don't think anyone here at this table has said there's been no problems with the Portland ordinance. We know it just went into effect in January. What we have said is that some of the cities, such as San Francisco, D.C., and Seattle, that have adopted this, have not seen businesses leave, close down, and in fact, some of the businesses that were originally in opposition now say it's not that big a deal. And in fact, those economies are actually booming. I'm obviously not saying because of that ordinance, but business is booming in those cities. So I think it's time for us to move on this. I think we are having a debate and a discussion. Just because there happens to be a majority that it wants to move forward does not preclude debate and discussion. So I'd like to make a motion. I move to direct the city manager to bring back to council an ordinance establishing minimum standards for employers to provide earned paid sick time to employees and to ensure that all persons working within the city of Eugene have the right to earn and use paid sick time. The ordinance shall include a preamble describing the public health justification for the ordinance and conditions under which an employee may use the paid sick time, as well as the following provisions. Establish an accrual rate of 1 hour paid sick time for every 30 hours worked that may be taken in 1 hour increments. Allow workers to accrue a minimum of 40 hours in a year with the ability for unused earned time to carry over to the next year, but at no time shall employers be required to allow employees to use paid sick time in excess of 40 hours in a year. Accrual to begin upon employment with access to earned sick time starting when employee has been employed 90 calendar days. Ordinance shall apply to all employers whose employees work within the city of Eugene. The ordinance shall have an implementation date of July 1st, 2015.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Councilor Zelenka.
Yes, thank you. In Portland, they did have, in the 5 months, bullies, 600,000 people in Portland. They've had 25 complaints. Only 4 went to investigation. Given the size of Portland and Eugene, if that were true here, we'd probably see 6 complaints in the first, and 1 would go to investigation. Investigation meaning that it had merit. But so it's not that it doesn't have issues. It's not that big of a deal. I think this is one of the most important issues that we'll discuss at council in a very long time. It's an issue of fairness to workers, but being mindful of the impacts on business. And when it came to my attention and Councilor Clare's attention back in February that over 25,000 workers in Eugene don't have access to even a single day of paid sick leave, and it applies to 78% of people at the lowest end of the pay scale, which are disproportionately women and minorities, they unfortunately are put in the position of having to choose to stay home sick or stay home with to care for their child or being fired in some cases. And if they were forced to go to work sick at a restaurant or server or grocery checker, they create a public health issue which is potentially infecting their coworkers and the public that they serve. So I didn't think that this was right, and I didn't think it was fair. And I've heard and talked to numerous people who have been waiting for years for this policy and heard story after story of the hardship and unfairness that they're having by not having earned paid sick time. And I've also thought a great deal about the ask that we're making of businesses, especially those that are just getting by. And I believe that we can craft an earned paid sick time ordinance that keeps the cost of business quite low with only a modest administrative burden. And it's important to note the intent here is not to take away but to add sick leave, and that if you're an employer that already provides earned paid sick time or PTO or has that similar kind of benefits, you're already in compliance and you don't really need to do much. So in the end, it's a trade-off, and for me, the benefits far outweigh the costs, and that's why I co-sponsored this ordinance. And this motion. I'm eager to hear from the community about how we can make this better and tweak it and Eugeneize it, especially through the administrative rules process that we have, that the city manager said that he would do. But this is a good motion. It's a good place to start with this motion. It outlines the 5 basic policy tenets that I think a sick leave or sick time ordinance should have. 1, establishes an accrual rate of 1 hour of sick time for every 30 hours worked, allows workers to accrue 40 hours of sick time and carry that over to next year if they're not using it, sets a cap on employers so that no more than 40 hours can be used in a year, and allows sick leave to be taken after 90 days of employment, and it applies to all employees within the city of Eugene.
I've got Mike and then George.
I'm sorry, I thought George was first. I'll let him go before me.
Well, go ahead, Mike. I mean, I was before Alan anyway, so it doesn't make any difference.
Please go ahead, because I'm going to make an amendment after you.
If I get a second to this, I move to amend the last sentence of the motions so that it reads, quote, "The ordinance shall have an implementation date of July 1, 2015, except that the ordinance shall become effective only after it is approved by electors of the city and an election to be held in November 2014.
Second.
Moved and seconded.
The reason why I want to put this out to the vote, because it is such a big issue facing the council, as Alan has pointed out, I want to put it out to the vote of the public to let them decide on if they want this. If they want to create a competitive disadvantage for our businesses with the businesses across the freeway in Springfield or up the highway in Junction City or out west or south of us. It just, to me, the only proper way to do this, since it is such a big divisive topic, is by letting the voters decide. So.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mike was next.
Oh, I was going to make a second amendment, and as process, I can't do that until we dispose of this amendment. Is that correct?
Yes, unless your amendment is to George's amendment.
You can amend his amendment, or add to it.
So if yours relates to sending this out to the voters, then you could move to amend George's amendment. If yours relates to something, to another part of...
I'll speak to this, but I'll ask that the mayor put me in the queue after this amendment's been disposed for another amendment. The challenge here is that, and I agree with George's amendment, I'll be happy to vote for that, but I don't believe that we have the votes at the table for that to pass based on just basic conversations we've had. That's going to force other people to collect signatures on it, and it's going to be divisive, and that's something I find unfortunate if this is so important for us to do. Part of the reason I have a problem with that, and I think so many other people do, and why it probably would not pass at the polls, is because this is not the appropriate work of the city council. This is social engineering, and that's not our job. And with any kind of social engineering attempts, you get unintended consequences. So it's my strong hope that we're going to have very detailed conversations through this process about what kinds of consequences we might expect or we might experience. And if we don't know, or if we say we can't know, then I hope we'll do the requisite work to make intelligent decisions, because while, as Chris says, we can't have complete certainty, we can have a great deal more than we have so far. We can ask business owners specific questions and know the answers and know exactly who would move and who wouldn't. There's a finite number of them. So I suggest we do a better job of gauging consequences in this process if we're not willing to subject the idea to a public vote.
Chris?
Well, the city council has the authority to pass this, and the legal authority is that it can do this. And there is no requirement that we go to the public to have a mandate or a decision on this. Occasionally, issues do arise, though, that I think a decision could benefit from knowing where the public's support or opposition rests. I had this idea around Civic Stadium, that we might have the voters give us their support for what to do with that. And I think this rises to the same level, simply because it is such a high-profile issue. And imagine if you were able to go forward and say 75% of this community has voted that it wants this. That gives you an enormous, powerful mandate to do this. Unlike many other communities who can say, well, our city council thought we should do it, but, you know, we don't know if the community supports it. And that could have been 8 years or 1 year. And maybe there hasn't been a problem, but you don't really know fundamentally. So I would actually be inclined to support George's motion, maybe for a different reason, because I think you could wind up with something that gives you an enormously powerful mandate to do something that you wanted to do if the community was indeed supportive of it. Okay, so what's the trade-off? To put this on the November ballot may mean you have to go another 100 days from when you're thinking you might pass something now. But to me, that's a fair trade, 100 days for a powerful mandate that clearly and certainly says this community wants it. To me, is an absolutely fair trade. You get something very, very powerful in return for another 100 days. So for me, that would be the reason to do it, not because I'm looking for some way to get out of doing it, but actually looking for some way to have the community give you the mandate to do it if that's what the community wants. And some folks say, oh, well, that gives the business community time to marshal their funds and convince everybody not to vote for it. I have enough confidence in the voters of the city of Eugene. I don't think they can be bought that easily. I think they're smart. And I think that if we present this issue to them thoughtfully and carefully and fully, they can make a clear decision. And I would really think that having that community opinion behind us would definitely be the mandate we need to provide the level of certainty that this issue needs. But I'm worried, because it is so high profile, that it's very difficult to say this was the authority of 4 people or 5 people, rather than say this was the authority of a whole community.
Claire?
Thank you. I think that setting minimum wage hour laws, workplace safety regulations is absolutely in the purview of a city government. We can choose to fill this current gap in protecting the health of workers and for our neighbors, for our friends, for our coworkers. Polling has been done that shows that Eugene residents want to see this council, their elected representatives, adopt an ordinance. 75% of voters support the city passing this law, and 72% of them supported having the city council take up the matter and pass the law. I have a stack of the letters that unfortunately Councilor Polling believes don't have validity. A huge stack of letters of people who personally are asking us to pass this. These are folks in my ward. I know every councilor got a similar stack of letters taken on people's doorsteps where it was explained to them what this campaign was about and what we were trying to accomplish, and that I believe over 3,200 people have signed this letter. It would be great if we could have an unadulterated conversation in the community about this, but we already know. We had an op-ed in the Register Guard this week from a DC-based lobbyist who works for some very large corporations who do not care about the small businesses of Eugene, who do not care about the workers of Eugene. I am not worried about our local businesses working with us to craft this ordinance and make it workable for them. But if we send this out to a ballot measure, we are going to have more Washington-based, DC-based lobbyists coming into our community to tell us what to do, muddying the waters and making it much more divisive. I don't think this needs to be a divisive conversation, but if we send this out to the ballot, people who represent Walmart and other large corporations along those lines are going to come in here and use us as a playing ground for themselves, not caring what happens to our workers and our businesses here in Eugene. So I think that would be a phenomenal waste of money for the city and create divisiveness where I don't believe it currently exists. So I'm not going to support this amendment, of course.
I've got Alan and then Mike.
Yeah, I think the recent polling that showed 75% in support, the 3,200 signatures that we got, pretty good indicator of support, and it's good enough for me. I think Claire is correct in that the DC well-paid DC lobbyists that for big business that put that op-ed there saying it isn't about workers, which was almost laughable, is reflective of the kind of conversation we'd have in a very divisive campaign. So I'm not supportive of this motion or amendment. Whether or not it's in the purview, along with the things that in the purview of government, along with the things that Claire said about there is worker discrimination, there's health and safety, there are worker safety rules. there is a role for government to play in maintaining a safe public health issue, as well as maintaining that within a workplace. And I think this falls within that. There's also a place for government to talk about economic fairness, and this also falls within that. So we can respectfully disagree of whether or not we think that's the role of government or not. And I'm sure, and I already have had that disagreement with numerous people. So, and that's part of the debate. But I'm not in favor of this motion, but I am in favor of moving forward to put something to the public for the public hearing on July 21st.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. And my great fear for this issue has now come to pass, that it becomes divisive. To this point in the conversation, I've mentioned my concerns with the effects I think we will see. I haven't defined those in support of this, or those who speak in support of this. There are many people who would speak in opposition, and some have. I think it's just as easy to say this whole campaign is organized by national lefty groups that, I mean, it's easy enough to say that, but here we go. I think it's really unfortunate when we stoop to that level where we start defining the people involved in the debate rather than the ideas. I would prefer that we keep this to ideas. And I, like Chris, agree that I absolutely trust the people of this community. I don't believe for a minute the authenticity of the poll because it was conducted by an interest group, just like I'm sure if a national business organization conducted a poll, it would be just as easily dismissed. I would believe the vote of our community and would follow it, as I always have. Absolutely. If it passed that that's what a majority of people in this community wanted, you better believe we should do it. But I don't believe for a minute that it would. And I challenge my colleagues that believe in this poll they mentioned to put it to the people and say, okay, we know that 75%, the numbers you mentioned, agree that this is a good idea. So we just need, as Chris mentioned, the greater, legitimacy of doing this work. And we'd like you to say yes and see what happens. Because I don't for a minute believe it would pass.
George Brown.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I'm not going to support this amendment. There is widespread support for the ordinance, and it is well within the purview of the City Council to do this. You may call it social engineering if you care to, but if that's your definition of social engineering, I'm all for it, because what would you call the 40-hour work week? Government did that. What would you call the child labor laws? That's social engineering too, I guess. How about worker safety regulations? OSHA, BOLI. That's social engineering. The Civil Rights Act, 1966. Voting Rights Act. That's all social engineering, I suppose. I mean, according to that definition. So if that's the case, I'm all for it. And there's really no, I'd just like to respond to something else that Councilor Clark said. There's really no evidence from San Francisco and D.C. That any of those businesses were put at a competitive disadvantage. It hasn't been in place that long in Portland. No, preliminary results from Seattle suggest the same thing. No one's been put to a competitive disadvantage. So, I think these are some understandable fears that are being expressed here. It's totally understandable. I'm a small businessman too, and I understand how hard it is to keep things going. Very well aware of that. This will actually be a benefit for everybody. It is definitely a health and public safety issue. when workers have to go to work when they're ill, I think during the H1N1 pandemic, I think a lot of it was spread by people having to show up for work or get fired, and so it's I'm not going to support this. I'll support the main motion. Thanks.
We're going to vote on Councilor Polling's motion. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3. Councilor Evans?
No.
Okay. In opposition? 1, 2, 3, 4. Councilor Evans?
No, I'm in opposition.
Yes, so we're voting in opposition. So that's 5 in opposition and 3 in support. So the motion goes down. Councilor Mike. Councilor Mike.
Councilor Mike, all right.
That's Councilor Mike.
I move to add to the end of this motion a provision that the ordinance come back with a 1-year sunset so that we might review the effects of this on our community.
Second.
Moved and seconded.
May I just speak to that, Mayor? As was a part of the task team's recommendation, there were at least a couple of folks whose comments I read that recommended this, and I agree with it. I think that if we're going to spend this much time and effort in talking about the consequences, and I hope we will, talk further about the potential consequences for each of these pieces, without just dismissing them out of hand and ramming this through, I would certainly hope that we're willing to stop and review the consequences of a divisive idea, much as we have many of the others. It was controversial for us to have an exclusion ordinance in our downtown area, and we had a sunset date on it so that we could have a regular review of the effects. And I believe it would be just as prudent for us to have a review of the effects, especially if it has a very detrimental effect on the city's budget.
I've got Chris and Claire in the queue, and before we talk about, I call on them in regard to this proposal from Councilor Mike. I'd just like to say that what I personally would support is a language about reviewing the ordinance after a year as opposed to a sunset. Okay, Councilor Pryor.
Councilor Chris. I would have maybe suggested something similar. And the only reason that I wouldn't support Mike's motion, because I agree review is very important. You want to know whether something is working or not. The only reason I might not support a sunset date is, unlike some of the other things that do appropriately have a sunset, if you go down this road and trigger this thing, it's going to create an enormous amount of work on the part of businesses. I mean, they'll have to do some reprogramming, they'll have to do some renegotiating, there'll be a fair amount of stuff they have to do. And if you have a sunset date on here, it creates some uncertainty as to whether I've gone to a lot of HR work for something that may be set to go away in a year. So I am absolutely very supportive of the notion of this comes back for a serious review after a year, but I don't want to create uncertainty in the part of the business community to say, you're going to do all this work with something that has a sunset date on it. So I appreciate the sentiment, I really do, but I don't think I can support that particular amendment. But a review, I think, would be very important to have.
Mayor?
Yes, Councilor Evans.
I move to amend Councilor Clark's motion from a sunset to a review.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Councilor Brown?
Well, I'm not going to support this because a review after 1 year implies that you're going to gather all the statistics from the 1 year, and it's going to be difficult to do that. It needs to go on for a while. It needs to be in effect for a while. And I'm just, frankly, I'm puzzled how implementation of this ordinance, should we do that, would affect the city's ability to collect property taxes and fund city services that Councilor Clark's mentioned a couple of times. I don't see the connection there. But anyway, I won't support it. We can do some kind of a review after I think maybe after a couple of years, but but I mean, we can do that when the time comes. But it needs to be in effect for a while to see what, how well it works and get everyone in compliance. And there's still some people in D.C. that aren't in compliance after all these years. So, thank you.
So I think I have Claire and Alan and Betty in the queue, and I'm just reminding everybody that we're 5 minutes. We're supposed to be done here.
I'll keep it short. I don't support the amendments in either form. I don't think we need to build in a review. We wouldn't want to sunset a public health measure after 1 year, but we should review how it's working, and I agree with Councilor Brown that, probably more like 2 years in is a good time to go and revisit and see what the challenges or benefits have been and if there's a way to make it better. I also think we should and be deliberate about looking at Portland's review of theirs, which will be a year next January, and Commissioner Fritz said they did have an intention of collecting data and doing some analysis of their ordinance, and so I do ask city staff that, assuming we keep moving forward with this process here, that we at some point bring that information to this council and look at what Portland's experience has been.
Mayor?
Yes, Councilor Evans?
I
Are you be in the queue, or are you changing your motion in any way?
I'd like to change my motion to go from 1 year to 24 months.
Who was the second on that?
I was.
Betty? You second
Sure.
that? She says yes. Okay, so
2 years.
2 years. Okay, Alan and then Betty.
Yeah, I don't support a sunset either because this is a public health issue as much as anything. I do support looking at it, but I'm glad Councilor Evans changed that because I don't think 1 year is enough time. I think we would just start to be having it be implemented and working through some of the implementation issues by that time. And if all works as according to plan in other jurisdictions, there's usually a grace period of about 6 months where people have a grace period or a easing in period, and enforcement doesn't really start, or fines don't really start until after that period of time. So I don't think that 1 year gives us the adequate amount of time. I'll support a review because I think that's something that we should always do when we implement something. We should always go back and look at it and say, is this working the way we intended? And to tweak it to make it better.
Betty?
I think a sunset's a terrible idea. We did the sunset on the renters' rights, and that causes people who don't work full-time at supporting that to have to gather their forces again every time there's a sunset threatened. And this reminds me of the smoking ban, which nobody's trying to get rid of now, but it was very controversial, and people said that was divisive and it was going to hurt business and make businesses all move out of Eugene. I don't think it happened.
Okay, so right now we're going to vote on Councilor Evans' motion to amend Councilor Clark's motion to 2 years. Yes.
Does Councilor Evans' motion, or maybe he could read it, does that contain the sunset?
No.
It's just a review?
Review in 2 years.
Just a review.
Yeah.
Councilor Brown, was review for 24 months. That's a 24-month period.
After the implementation date?
After the implementation,
1st, 2015.
Did he say after 24 months?
Yeah, after
Okay.
24 months.
Okay. All those in favor, please indicate.
Aye.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In opposition? 2. It passes. Now we're back to the main, we're back to,
The main motion is, the
amendment
is amended.
Mike's motion. All those in favor of Mike's motion as amended?
Which is what?
Which is Greg.
24
Which
months.
is now Greg's.
Right.
Right.
That's
Okay.
great.
No longer.
Review.
All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Greg?
Aye.
6. In opposition? 2. It passes. So now then we're back to the main motion as amended. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Greg?
Aye.
6. In opposition? 2. Yes.
I just wanted to quickly say the reason I supported Councilor Surratt's motion was, at this point, we didn't have anything in front of us to debate. If we want to get onto the important work of debating something, we need to bring it to the table, and Councilor Surratt's motion brings something to the table so we can continue the work.
Alan?
Yes, real quickly, I agree with what Chris has said. This puts forward something to have brought back at the public hearing on the 21st. Also in front of you is a hard copy of the Earned Paid Sick Time Administrative Rules process. I think this process is very important. It's one that the city manager agreed to do, involves the creation of an advisory committee to help us run through all the implementation issues and craft a set of administrative rules. Identifies 8 issues, but it's not intended to be inclusive or exclusive. It gives preference to best practices in the 8 other jurisdictions and cities that have adopted earned paid sick time ordinances, and it gives businesses ample time to deal with it once it's in place. It gives them 5 months, as opposed to Portland, which gave them 2 months before it gets implemented in July. And finally, it provides ample community input in the consultation with other surrounding jurisdictions on the details. And so I believe the process, along with the motion about this, it should be viewed together, and the administrative rules are going to be very important part of implementation of this, and as well as the motion that outlines the 5 basic tenets of, I think these 2 things are a good place to start for the community conversation on the 21st at the public hearing.
Councilor Pauling?
Yeah, I would move that we postpone moving the administrative rules process forward, because there are some points in there that I disagree with, but at this point, looking at the table, it makes no sense to waste any more council's time trying to correct a problem that we're creating.
Clarify, this isn't a motion.
I know.
This is just something the city manager agreed to.
So I'd just like to make a comment. This morning, I had a visit from one of the members of the Chamber of Commerce, Bill Whalen, and he asked me to put forward the idea that we should involve human resource people in writing the rules, and that we should make a real outreach to bring those kind of professionals to the table. And I told him I would bring that to the meeting today. So,
good idea.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.